Many countries around the world have high-speed rail. Unfortunately, we cannot say the same for Canada. However, things might be about to change. Last year in 2025, Canada's government announced the Alto high-speed rail project. Some broad details about the project has been mentioned, and also the team that will plan and build this project has been chosen, but not everything is clear since they just started a 5-year development phase. The goal of this project is to bring a first high-speed rail line in Canada, more specifically between the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. The proposed project has 7 different stations. The line would have stations in Toronto, Peterborough, and Ottawa on the Ontario side, and for the Quebec side, it would be in Montreal, Laval, Trois Rivières, and the Ville de Québec. So the whole line from Toronto to Quebec would be almost 1,000 kilometers long. The positive effects of such a project is obvious. It would finally bring high-speed rail to Canada, which is the only G7 country that doesn't have it. It would cut travel times on many routes such as Toronto to Ottawa, Toronto to Montreal, or Montreal to Quebec. And of course, it's more pleasant and comfortable to travel by train rather than by plane. But today we're not only here to discuss about the benefits of high-speed rail. I want to talk more about what the route will look like and go through every city to give suggestions about where to build the stations and what to do around it to make the project as good as possible. So we start our journey in Toronto, the most populous metro area in Canada with around 7 million people. Even though the access to bring the high-speed rail line downtown might be complex, the best location for the station is obviously Union Station. It's in the heart of downtown Toronto. It's easily the best station in the country. It has so many services going through it: the subway, the commuter trains, the Via Rail trains, the Up Express to the Pearson Airport, the streetcars, the buses, everything basically. Billy Bishop Airport is also only a 15-minute streetcar ride away. The Union Station's location is basically perfect. I will probably repeat that many times in this video, but if you want as many people as possible to use the high-speed train, you have to connect the stations with good rapid transit. If people need to rent a car or call an Uber to do anything at their destination, then it's not very motivating to take the high-speed train compared to driving. Sure, for the people flying, they'll have the same problem. They will need to call an Uber or a taxi or whatever at the airport, but don't forget that most people choose driving to go anywhere, and that includes trips doable by high-speed train or flying. So if we want to motivate these people to ditch their cars in favor of the high-speed train, then having good public transit at their destination is necessary. Otherwise, they'll just stick to driving. And this rapid transit should obviously have a stop at the train station to make transfers as smooth as possible. Besides Union Station, I think Toronto deserves a second station. So somewhere around Markham or Pickering could be great, depending on the actual path the train will take. Another obvious candidate would be to link Toronto Pearson Airport. The tracks of the Up Express service could be upgraded by building dedicated electrified tracks that could also be used by the high-speed train. You could just run both the Up Express and the high-speed train on the same tracks, because the high-speed train won't be able to reach very high speeds inside of the cities. Therefore, it won't be slowed by the Up Express trains, which means you could run an improved version of the Up Express as a shuttle between Toronto Airport and downtown, and people that land at the airport but need to go somewhere else in Canada, such as Ottawa or Montreal. For example, if these people didn't find a good connecting flight, then these people could just exit the airport and right away take a high-speed train to go anywhere they want. And the Pearson station could be a great starting point for a phase 2 of this project, to extend the high-speed train deeper into Ontario, to Waterloo, London, and Windsor, for example. But anyway, after Toronto, we get to our second station of the network, Peterborough. The estimated time to cover that 140-kilometer trip is about 40 minutes, which is fast, but maybe a bit optimistic, because most of the corridor where the high-speed train tracks would be built is along some Canadian Pacific tracks, and they did not build these things straight back in the days. Straight tracks are necessary if you want to achieve the highest speeds possible. Actually, it will be possible to make the tracks more straight, but that means acquiring more land, which will cost some some money. So a calculation would have to be made, but that might be worth it in some places. Anyway, Peterborough is our smallest city of the network, with a population of about 130,000 people. It was chosen mainly because it was the only big enough city to put a train station at between Toronto and Ottawa. You can argue that the project could go to Kingston instead by building new dedicated tracks along Highway 401, and it's also a slightly more populous city. But I'd argue that Peterborough is a more direct path towards Ottawa, and it does not currently have rail service. Meanwhile, Kingston already has rail service on the Toronto to Montreal line. That service could be improved, however, but that's a topic for another video. The Canadian Pacific tracks go through Peterborough. However, there does not seem to have a well-defined downtown area in that city, but I would place it as centered as possible, with a bit of land around for new dense housing development and shops and transit connections. But besides that, I don't know too much about Peterborough, so if you know a bit more about it, tell me in the comments. After Peterborough, a journey of about 270 kilometers without stations awaits us, which is the longest stretch without stations of the whole network. And we finally get to Ottawa, with an estimated travel time of about an hour and 30 minutes, which again could be a bit too optimistic, because the right-of-way of the Canadian Pacific tracks are again not straight at all, which brings the question if Alto won't change their minds and go to Kingston instead. In Ottawa, obviously the Ottawa train station will be used. There's a bunch of empty land and parking lots around, so there's space for an expansion of the station and also other developments. The station has a link to the O train, so that's cool, so people taking the high-speed train to Ottawa will have a rapid transit connection. As for the airport, the O train already goes there, and it's quite a bit further south. And as we said, the O train also goes to the train station, so I don't really think it would be beneficial to extend the high-speed train to the airport. In Toronto, I can see it makes sense, but a bit less here, but maybe for a later phase though. After Ottawa, a journey of almost 200 kilometers awaits us, which the train could cover in an estimated 58 minutes. But after Ottawa and crossing into Quebec, we finally get to our next city, Montreal. Okay, Montreal is probably the most interesting and challenging part of the network. There's many possible scenarios of where to put the station, so let's go through some of them. The first option would be to go to Gare Centrale, the main train station in downtown Montreal. It has great connections to the VRL trains, the Orange line of the metro, and the REM. However, Gare Centrale is a tricky station because you cannot go through it. It's basically a terminus. You'll tell me, yeah, but many train stations around the world is the same thing. Trains go in, but then they need to go backwards when leaving. And yes, this is true, but in this case, it would be very valuable to be able to continue after Gare Centrale, because after Montreal, the train will need to go towards Laval and the North Shore. But the only rail corridors available to do that is to leave Gare Centrale going backwards, using the same tracks that the train used to get from Ottawa, going around the Montréal and then turning northbound. That would be the first solution, which is okay, but the train would waste a lot of time going on this detour. The second solution would still keep the station at Gare Centrale, but we would need to build a new tunnel under the Montréal to act as a shortcut towards Laval, since it's the most direct path possible. This would be a tunnel of a bit more than 5 kilometers, so that could get expensive quickly. However, it could decrease travel times by a lot. The line 12 of the Montreal commuter line does the trip around the Montréal that I talked about earlier, and it takes about 27 minutes up to where the end of the tunnel would be. And this train takes a faster route, since it leaves from the Lucien Lallier station rather than Gare Centrale. Meanwhile, with the tunnel, the train could take as less as 5 minutes to cross the Montréal. And another argument in favor of the tunnel is that it could also be used by other northbound services, such as line 12 and 15 of the commuter rail, and also potential future train lines going northbound. And same thing as Toronto, this would motivate the Quebec government to electrify the tracks, and thus improve commuter train service, which is very bad in Montreal. Hi, it's me in the future. While editing this video, I've seen RM Transit talking exactly about this topic, and he has great points. So I wanted to discuss a bit more about the downsides of building a tunnel, but also a counter argument to that. The tunnel would obviously be very expensive and not necessarily worth it, because that tunnel would not be used on the main part of the project, basically Toronto to Montreal. It would be used to bring trains northbound towards the city of Quebec, which is the least populous part of the network. So at least for a first phase of the project, I think it's enough to go around the Montréal rather than with a tunnel. The only reason I can see the tunnel make sense is if there's other services using it, as we talked about, for example, being used by commuter trains. But as Reese mentioned, EXO seems a bit lazy to improve its commuter trains right now. But with the high-speed train, we're talking about the 10 to 15 years horizon. But of course, EXO and the government of Quebec will need to collaborate. And another thing about the tunnel is that running trains depends on the frequencies of these trains. Even more if the tunnel is built single track, which I doubt, but yeah. Another important factor in favor of the tunnel is that if the Montreal to Quebec line gets a lot of ridership, which honestly is very possible if you think of it. In 2024, tourism in the province of Quebec was done in an overwhelming majority by Quebec residents themselves, not residents from other provinces. There's many people that do the trip between Quebec and Montreal, and not only because Quebec is a touristic city. There's a lot of people that, for example, live in Quebec or have family in Quebec, but they go to work or study in Montreal because it's a bigger city and has more opportunities. But then they come back to Quebec to visit family occasionally, like once a week or once a month. And you can see a similar trend in Ontario. Almost 94% of trips in Ontario were done by Ontario residents, while only about 4% by Quebec residents. Therefore, we can argue that most of the ridership would come from within the province rather than between provinces. And that's why having lines from Montreal to Quebec or Toronto to Windsor is very important. Maybe even more important than Montreal to Ottawa or Montreal to Toronto. Yes, this part of the network makes sense, and it's obviously attractive because it links many of the big cities in Canada, but it's also wrong to only look at the population. You have to think about what trips people make. So yes, Quebec and Windsor and London might be smaller cities, but since travel within the provinces is very common, those kinds of links might actually get very busy. So this is why I think maybe building the tunnel in Montreal to go towards Quebec might be worth it after all. But of course, let me know in the comments what you think about this. Okay, enough talking about the tunnel, let's get back to the me of the past. A third option would be to go to the Lucien Lallier station instead, which is the downtown final station for 3 of the 5 Montreal commuter train lines. The way in and out of Lucien Lallier is also a bit more direct compared to Gare Centrale. A last option I can think of is to build a completely new station somewhere else, away from downtown but connected to some rapid transit. Building such a station in Montreal could also help to reduce travel times, since you don't need to go on a detour to go to downtown Montreal. I've seen people proposing to build it next to a metro or REM station in the west, but I don't know about any good candidates, so feel free to discuss about this in the comments. Besides a station in Montreal, I think a second one could be built at Montreal's International Airport. One option would be to have it at the current Dorval train station, but since it's about 1 kilometer from the airport terminal, some link would have to get built between the station and the airport. One solution would be to extend the REM all the way to the train station, but if I'm not mistaken, CDPQ Infra did not really like this idea. Another solution could be to build a people mover up to the airport, or a more complex and expensive solution, but probably the best one, would be to build the train station in the airport, below it actually. That might sound crazy or not worth it, but many cities did this. I can think of Zurich, for example. Yes, it's the second time in 2 consecutive videos that I talk about Zurich. I really like this city. Zurich's airport has an underground station right under the airport terminal. There is 4 different tracks, so it's not a small station. And there is a crazy amount of services that go to this station. Just look at that. You can take commuter trains, national trains, and even international trains to Germany. There is even a direct train to Geneva Airport, the other main Swiss airport. So you can go basically everywhere by train after landing in Zurich. It's just so convenient. Therefore, Montreal Airport could definitely benefit from such a train station. It could be used by so many different services. Maybe not as many as Zurich, but better than the 0 that we have now. For example, if you need to simply go downtown, you'll have the REM. If you want another way to go downtown, you'll have the line 12 of the commuter train. And new commuter rail lines starting from the airport could be created. And if you are landing in Montreal, but you want to go elsewhere in Quebec or Ontario or whatever, you'll have the VRL trains and the high-speed trains right at the airport. The possibility possibilities are pretty much endless, so I really think it's worth it to have such a big project to build such a station at the airport, even though it would be another very complex infrastructure for the high-speed train project, and that would need to be in cooperation with the Quebec government and the airport. But anyway, enough dreaming, and let's continue to the next station, Laval. Whatever the option is used, either a tunnel or using the existing track corridor around the Mont-Royal, the train will probably use the current Line 12 commuter train corridor. But of course, this will probably need to get widened and electrified. For the station, the most obvious choice would be to build it at the De la Concorde station, because it is a station of the Line 12 commuter train and it also connects to the Orange line of the metro. And that station would be very beneficial. People from the suburbs and the North Shore of Montreal will be able to take the train there, instead of wherever the Montreal station will be. Maybe another place will get chosen along the Canadian Pacific Rail corridor in Laval, but if they choose this option, I hope it comes along rapid transit development in Laval, which would not be a bad thing because Laval is quite populous but doesn't have much rapid transit at all. I'd love to see a RAM expansion or LRT line in Laval, for example, which could be linked to a potential new high-speed train station, but I definitely think De la Concorde station is the one that makes most sense. After Laval, we go on a journey of around 140 kilometers, which could take around 40 to 50 minutes according to Alto, and in this case I don't think it's too optimistic, because the Canadian Pacific corridor is very straight. They did a great job when building it. They didn't do large steep curves every kilometer. Trois Rivières is the 9th most populous city in Quebec, with only about 140,000 people. However, it's right between Quebec and Montreal, and it hasn't had any train service in decades. Therefore, it's a perfect city for the high-speed train to stop at. There is an old train station in Trois Rivières, so at least we got something to start with. It is also well located in the city. There doesn't seem to be a real city center area in Trois Rivières, but the station is definitely not in the middle of nowhere. There are buses in the city, but they're not frequent at all, so that would need to improve. And if we really feel ambitious, why not build a very short tram line from the train station to the Rue des Forges, which seems to have many shops and many commercial buildings, and it seems to be pedestrianized in the summer, which is very cool to see. And then it could continue on the Boulevard des Forges to go all the way to the Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, which is the university of the city, as you can guess with the name. It would be a short but very useful line, linking the University of the city, the train station, and also residential and commercial areas. Before you call me crazy or over-ambitious, remember that in France, there's cities with smaller populations with trams. Yes, Trois-Rivières is way less dense than those cities, but that area of the city I mentioned is pretty dense and will link important stuff. And also building transit can lead to building more dense housing, especially neighborhoods with a good mix between housing and commercial buildings, which is something that we need a lot in Quebec and Canada in general. After another journey of an estimated 40 minutes, we finally get to the city of Quebec, which is the capital city of Quebec and has a bit more than 800,000 people in its metro area. For the train station, the most obvious choice would be to use the Gare du Palais, which currently has Via Rail train service. There's not a lot of space, but maybe they could build more platforms in the station in a way that would not hurt the historical building. Sure, they could reuse existing platforms, but I'm not a fan of this solution because it does not promote the expansion of the rail service. For example, at an airport, if you plan to bring more passengers, you will probably want to build more gates because more planes will be landing at your airport. Then the same should be done here for the train station and for the project in general. Two more important things about the Quebec situation of this project. First, I think it's very sad that the current Quebec tramway project does not include a stop at the Gare du Palais. Actually, having a stop at the train station is part of a second phase of the tramway project, which is good to hear. It could get built in parallel to the high-speed train project, since the first phase of the tramway is expected to start construction in 2027, and the high-speed train is still very far from starting construction at all. A second idea about Quebec: on its way to Montreal and Toronto and the other cities, the train will run on a rail corridor very near to the Quebec airport, about 1.5 kilometers south. That is very close, and it would be dumb not to take advantage of that and build a link to the airport. And I might be ambitious here, but that track from downtown Quebec to the airport could even be used by a new local commuter train line. The city of Quebec does not currently have any commuter train, so that would be a great starting point to motivate the city and the Quebec government to bring a commuter rail network to Quebec. The other option could also be to extend the tramway phase 1 to the airport, which is something that was actually proposed and talked about in the media. This might be easier and a bit more realistic, I'll agree. So anyway, that's a good overview of the stations. I'm very happy that we might finally get high-speed rail in Canada, and I'm looking forward to cover more of that project in next videos. Before you go, I just wanted to announce that I created a Patreon page. I'm planning a lot of travel to South America and Europe in the next year, so it will be a perfect opportunity to make videos about transit projects in other countries. So if you want to support the channel to make such videos possible, even if it's just enough to buy me a coffee at the airport, I would gladly appreciate it, and also give me suggestions of places I could visit and make videos about. But anyway, the link of the Patreon is in the description of this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Canadian high-speed rail project. Comment if you disagree or agree with any of the propositions I talked about. Subscribe to the channel if you like my videos and if you want to watch more videos about transit in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.